When I think about winter, I think of a frozen lake. Standing on an iced-over body of water is a unique experience. Everyone should try it at least once. The quiet and isolation are hard to match anyplace else. When you stop walking and the crunch of the snow fades, you can almost hear the silence rushing in to insulate you. And if you wait long enough, you'll hear the ice shifting as the day warms. The sound is otherworldly. Look it up if you've never heard it. There are a few different varieties of vocal protests from the ice when it moves. One is a booming bass note that careens around the lake under the ice. The other is a high-pitched science fiction laser sound that chirps up from below. The first time you hear it, you might think there's a whale below the ice. No matter how many times it happens, it evokes a primal reaction for at least a second. Something primitive deep inside you, saying, you shouldn't be here. Any ice fisherman learns to bat these alarm bells aside and get on with it. But there was one time I should have listened. Our group of 4 friends rented a cabin on a different lake every winter. We'd grown up in the same area, but by middle age we all lived in different cities and states. When late February arrived, there'd be a weekend circled on the calendar for ice fishing. As the winters had grown warmer in the last few years, we'd booked houses farther and farther north to increase our chances of safe ice. The years that the lake didn't freeze over, we'd still get together, but could only drink beer and play board games inside. About 4 years ago, we convened at our most remote and northern lake yet. The weather forecast and ice fishing forums online essentially guaranteed us at least 14 inches of safe ice. For the uninitiated, you can walk and fish safely on 3 inches of ice. You can drive a snowmobile on 6, and you can drive a pickup truck on 12. We always moved on foot and pulled sleds. We'd be set. We all arrived within a few hours of one another. After the usual greetings and chat, we unloaded our respective cars and surveyed the house. It was aesthetically unremarkable, but would serve our purposes perfectly. There was a section of tiled floor beside the back door where we'd tromp in from the lake each evening, which was ideal for drying our fishing gear and boots. The extra fridge in the garage was a bonus, as we'd brought enough beer for a group twice our size, but that we knew would somehow be gone by Sunday. There was only about an hour of sunlight left, so hiking out onto the lake with all our gear to put up the collapsible shelter was a waste of time. Nonetheless, we were excited to get a lay of the land. Or lake, I guess. Let's at least see what the lake access looks like behind the house, guys, Pete suggested. He was easily the most impatient and headstrong among us. Coincidentally, this seemed to lead to him being the most successful fisherman most years. 4 sets of double-insulated, waterproofed boots trudged along the hardened snow, punching through with each step as we wandered down to the edge of the lake. It was immediately apparent that all of the neighboring houses were empty. This was typical when we rented a house for ice fishing. These homeowners probably only came here once each winter to check on things. They used these houses in the summer. Quiet and isolated was the way we liked it. No one to kick up a fuss if we stepped outside the hut to pee on the ice in broad daylight. The reality of ice fishing is that the neighbors nearby aren't likely to be a help if the worst happens and you fall through the ice. Your best bet is the friends you're with. If you all go through, well, good luck. No one will hear, and no one is coming. Luckily for us, we had virtually nothing to worry about with 14 inches of ice. The bigger concern would be cutting through it to drop lines and fish. Every year we griped about how long it took to bore holes with the hand auger, and every year we talk about buying a gas-powered version, but never do it. The lake was large relative to some we'd fished over the years. We optimistically assumed this meant we had a shot at larger fish. We stood, 4 across at the edge of the break wall, surveying the area. Pete was the first to brazenly leap down onto the ice. Some years this would have been a sure way to get his feet wet, but this winter was cold. Really cold. His boots landed with a soft thud. The novelty thermometer on the side of the house, charmingly built into a fish's skeleton, read -2. It was certain to drop as far as 10 below overnight. "We aren't alone," Matt said, with a staged dread in his voice. I glanced up and saw a lone fisherman about 100 yards off the shore. "Not much gear," I pointed out. He was standing over his ice hole, staring down. I couldn't even see if he had a fishing rod. We stood, quietly watching for a few minutes. We all knew it would be useful intel if we saw him pull up a fish. Finding a lively spot on the ice wasn't half the battle with ice fishing, it was the whole war. Hauling our sleds, setting up the shelter, staking it in the ice, and boring the holes took upwards of an hour. If we had to do that multiple times in a day, because we'd happened upon a dead spot, it was time-consuming and exhausting. But the man didn't pull up a fish. He suddenly lifted his head and looked in our direction. After a long moment, he waved his arms over his head like he was trying to signal us. Sound travels well over the ice, and it wasn't hard to hear what he shouted. "Get out!" And after a pause, "Get the hell out!" As quickly as he'd acknowledged us, he stopped. He looked down one more time and trudged away as the sun slipped behind the hills. We stood in shocked silence for a moment, watching him go. Dave broke the silence. "Well, he seemed nice." We chuckled lightly, still watching him march toward a point of land covered in pines off to the east. He rounded the trees and was gone. "Fishermen are so defensive of their spots," Matt said, rolling his eyes. "We're fishing wherever we want. Ooh, 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 ooh." I stared at the point and the trees for another moment as the guys ambled back onto the break wall. Something about the man's behavior was bothering me. He didn't seem like the average prickly fisherman defending his secret spot. We'd encountered plenty of those over the years. They were all the same. Lonely, fishing obsessed, assholes. This guy was just, well, weird. I couldn't say for sure what he wanted from us, and that bugged me. We passed the night as we always did on these trips: beer, music, and snacks. We joked about the local community lore on the lake. It seemed like every lake in America has its own monster story. Some are pretty well known, like Champ, the underwater dragon of Lake Champlain. But even the smaller lakes have one. The house had a few books on the coffee table, with corny covers that screamed self-published. One was all about local pseudo-history and tall tales. Apparently this lake was home to a massive serpent called Shep. Dave put a leg up on the coffee table's edge, held the book at arm's length, and read dramatically, "Locals know him as Nessie's American cousin, Shep, and he's longer than a freight train, and twice as ornery. His scales shimmer like 1,000 disco balls under the moonlight, and his eyes glow redder than a bullfrog in love. His name comes from the story of the beast, leaping from the water and dragging a fisherman's German shepherd clean off the dinghy as the owner slept in the sun." "Who the hell's telling that story if the fisherman was asleep?" I quipped. If the story's scaring you, just say so. You can't poke holes in a bona fide historical account, Pete lectured, keeping up the act. Sorry, you're right. Shep is out there, I said gravely. Before Matt could read any more, Pete's phone chirped brightly from the kitchen counter. Pete studied the number and announced, "It's the owner." He picked up the call and put it on speaker. We all cut out the joking around. We had maintained a good Airbnb rating for years, and were always careful to leave the owners with a good impression. After a friendly back and forth about the thermostat and instructions on what to do with the trash, the homeowner surprised us by saying, "So you're really going out on the ice, huh?" His tone was suddenly flat. Pete pulled a confused face and responded, "Sure, it's why we came up here. Why?" There was a long, pregnant pause. We could even hear the guys breathing for a moment on the other end. Pete was about to repeat himself when the owner said, "Oh, it's just real cold this weekend is all. Stay safe." With that, he abruptly disconnected the call without saying goodbye. We all exchanged incredulous looks and then burst into laughter. "These small towns, man, I don't know," scoffed Dave. As the guys exchanged theories on the private life of our host based on the phone call and the decor choices around the house, I grew quiet. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself. But when the guy on the phone had asked, "You're really going out there on the ice?" the strange man on the lake had flashed in my mind. The grim face, the frantic movements, the edge of warning in his voice. I did not share my misgivings with the group. As we got older, we adopted a more reasonable approach to sleep. We couldn't drink until 2 a.m. and then sit in an ice hut the next morning like we were 20 anymore. We wanted to be on the ice by 7, so we were all making our way to our rooms by 10 p.m. As I lay in bed, I listened to the wind pick up and begin to howl as it carved away snowdrifts and bent the frozen trees outside. I could picture the surface of the lake swirling with miniature tornadoes and rearranging the topography of snow. We won't find that guy's ice hole now anyway, I thought, secretly pleased to know we wouldn't violate whatever it was he was trying to ward us off from. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I was exhausted from the drive and the beers I'd drank with dinner. As we slept, snow began to fall, silently blanketing our cars and erasing our tracks on the lawn. For the first time ever, we met our goal of leaving the house on time. We'd eaten a hearty breakfast of Pop-Tarts and stiff Bloody Marys as we got our gear. Suiting up was quite the process, and after a disastrous first outing more than a decade prior, we understood the importance of real ice fishing gear. Heavy boots, durable, waterproof bibs, a fur-lined hat, and extra gloves. We stepped out into the bitter cold and trudged single file with loaded sleds behind us. The new snow made it slow going. The sleds sunk into the newly fallen snow instead of cruising along on top of the old, hardened stuff. We were huffing and puffing by the time we reached the break wall. As Matt and I handed the gear down to Dave and Pete, I noticed something. There was a large snowdrift around the spot we'd been standing yesterday as we watched the fishermen. "Was that there yesterday?" I asked. "No," Matt answered, "but the wind moved everything around last night." When the sleds were reloaded, we headed out toward the center of the lake. We paused beside the odd snowdrift, and I gave it a curious kick. My boot hit solid ice. We exchanged bemused expressions. Without speaking, we knelt down and brushed snow from the mound. We quickly saw that it wasn't a snowdrift. It was jagged ice. The lake's surface appeared to have broken, and the broken ice was thrust upward before refreezing in the night. Did someone go through here? A snowmobile? Dave ventured. That seems really unlikely. The ice is so thick, Pete answered. I just stared. In the snow and wind and cold, I knew we wouldn't be solving this mystery, but I had my own wild theory. The ice was fractured and formed a jagged heap. If someone had fallen through, there'd be a depression, if anything. I thought it looked like something had breached the ice from beneath. Processing the impossibility of that, I just shook my head. Super weird, Matt said with a tone of finality. We turned and carried on toward the deeper region of the lake. Dave had pinpointed what looked like a promising spot west of our house, where the lake depth dropped off significantly. If we positioned our hut correctly, we might have a chance at panfish and some bigger stuff. After a quarter of an hour, we were satisfied with the spot and began to unload the gear and erect the ice hut. All four of us were old hands with this routine by now. Because the wind wasn't blowing, it wasn't even unpleasant work. Within the hour, we were inside the hut with the propane heater ticking warmly in the corner. We all had lines down and were nursing beers when the first rod bent. It was Matt's. Everyone let out a whoop and cheered him on as he brought up a pretty good-sized perch. While it wasn't a prize walleye, it did mean that we weren't going to be skunked this weekend. There had been years when hours and hours on the ice had yielded 0 fish. There was always collective relief the first time someone hit something. "Whack 'em and stack 'em, baby!" Matt shouted, a well-worn victory refrain in our little crew. He packed the fish into the pile of snow beside his stool. By 3 in the afternoon, we were all mostly drunk and very happy with the day's fishing. We'd brought up 18 panfish, perch, bluegill, and rock bass. The day's big prize had been Dave's, a 23-inch northern pike. Now came the big decision. Call it a day and use the remaining light to break down the hut, or keep the fun going and deal with closing things down in the dark. The usual inebriated bravado ensued. Proclamations of a flurry of bites just minutes away, slurred accusations of cowardice, always the same. In the end, we stuck it out until the cold began to creep through our boots and bite at our toes. The irony of having a space heater in your ice hut is that the snow and slush that make up your floor steadily turn into a shallow pool of frigid water around your feet. We all decided on one more beer and a few more minutes fishing. With our thoughts half on the unpleasant chore of breaking down the shelter and hauling our sleds back to the house, we grew a bit more somber, nursing the last of our drinks. The crack was distinct. A deep, tectonic crunch broke the silence. Instinctively, we all sat bolt upright. I touched the orange-handled ice picks tucked into my thigh pockets. We'd heard legitimate cracking on the ice before, but this was different. We actually felt it. The ice inside our hut appeared to be intact, but it had to have happened to nearby. The pools of water in our fishing holes rose almost imperceptibly, and then dipped down again, leaving minute ripples that dissipated silently. No one spoke. We exchanged terrified looks. Pete spluttered about a nervous laugh. "It's time to go," Dave said gravely. We gingerly stood, one at a time. We pulled down the Velcro window covers, and the shelter was lit with the weak ambient light from outside. Moving slowly, we folded up stools and bagged the empty beer cans that littered snow piles in the corners. "Stop!" Matt shouted. My heart skipped a beat as I spun to look at him. I half thought I'd see the ice parting between his legs, but nothing seemed amiss. "What?" I said. an edge of indignance creeping into my voice. "There's a huge fish down there," he said with sudden reverence. We all looked down at the ice hole beside Matt's feet. "No," he corrected. "I saw it through the ice. I saw it go by. At least I saw its outline. If that was a fish, it's enormous." Something like real fear tempered his voice. "Like another pike?" Dave asked. "No, like a sturgeon. I don't know. Bigger," Matt said, barely more than whispering. His eyes were stretched wide open, staring down at the ice. "That seems unlikely," Pete retorted. "They stay really deep." We didn't have to debate. In a flash, a dark shadow more like 10 feet long cruised below our ice hut. If it didn't change directions like a fish, I would have assumed it was a downed tree floating by. But it did. The thing whipped and snapped its tail furiously, almost like it was already on a hook. We all held our breath as the fish moved out of sight beyond the boundary of our shelter. I looked at Matt and asked, "Do you want this fish?" He glanced up as if waking up from a dream. "Huh?" I'd had enough. I unzipped the door and stepped out into the ripping wind. I didn't take another step. Dead ahead of me stood the man we'd seen on the ice the day before. He was a good ways off. I don't think he spoke, but if he had, the wind would have consumed the sound. He met my gaze and shook his head solemnly. "Guys," I shouted in a shaking voice, "something is wrong here. We need to get off the ice." I pulled my gaze from the glowering man and pushed my head back through the open shelter door. The guys were still looking at the ice beneath them. "That guy is back. We need to get off the ice," I said again. This time, my panicked tone seemed to shake them loose from their trance. They each began gathering their things. "I'm okay with leaving the gear for tomorrow. Let's go now." There wasn't going to be an argument on this point because at that moment several things happened at once. The first thing was a voice from outside. It cut through the wind with supernatural power and bellowed a strange, vicious taunt. "Too late! I Paluvik! I Paluvik!" it roared. Before we could react, or even comprehend what was happening, a dark, hulking mass surged up from the dark below the ice. With impossible speed, it slammed into the ice beneath us. The ground broke with a deafening crack. Two immense slabs of ice split apart, tilting and pitching violently. The jagged edges of the fractured plates gaped like the mouth of some monstrous grin before slamming back together with a bone-rattling collision. Between the grinding flows, dark, frigid water churned and bubbled its way upward, spilling into the widening crevices. We were all on our backs now, splashing in the frigid water and scrambling to keep away from the crushing jaws of ice in the center of the shelter. The collision had broken loose most of the stakes, and we flailed backward to begin crawling desperately, with only the idea in mind to separate ourselves from the shelter. For a terrible instant, I felt myself sliding toward the fracture in the ice. If I wasn't crushed into a bag of guts and bone, my heavy clothes would drag me down fast. I pulled an ice pick from my snow pants and drove it into the ice beside me. With it firmly wedged, I'd dragged myself forward and scrambled away. The last thing I saw in that shelter was Pete, on the other side of the break, pushing himself backward like a crab, his boots kicking wildly at the slick ice floor. He'd reached the edge of the shelter, but I didn't see whether he'd gotten out. I emerged from the sagging shelter on my hands and knees, coughing and spitting ice water. Disoriented, I stood and staggered away with little thought to where I was going. When the noise of the grinding ice began to weaken, I paused and turned. Amazingly, all three of my companions stood, a similar distance from the ruined shelter. I looked for the man, but he was gone. The wind had formed a little mound of snow where he'd stood. The four of us convened nearer the shore and stared, dazed, at the wreck of fiberglass poles and fabric, now half submerged and quickly freezing into a crumpled version of itself. Wordlessly, we trudged off the ice and clambered over the break wall. We were keenly aware that we'd be hypothermic soon if we weren't already. Over the next hour or so, no one spoke. We peeled off the soaking and frozen garments and took turns using the shower to bring our core temperatures back up. Eventually, we called the police and reported that we'd had an accident on the ice. No one seemed to have the grit to explain that a fish, or whatever that was, had caused the ice to break. I think we only reported it because our gear would be found in the morning and people would worry. We still get together, the four of us, just in the summers now. We talk about what happened from time to time, sitting around a campfire, several beers deep. We like to talk about the thing swimming in that lake, what it was, if it's still there. We don't tend to bring up how we almost drowned. We looked up the strange word that man had shouted just before the thing broke the ice. Ipaluvik is an Inuit word, a malevolent sea god. For a time, we'd used the word to refer to the thing under the ice. But before long, we seemed to reach the same conclusion. We didn't want to say its name. A few months after it all happened, maybe March or early April that year, I know our fishing gear thawed from the ice and quietly slipped down to the bottom of the lake. I think, aside from the littering, we were all content to let it go.